Well, hello. As we approach the end of the riding season here in 2018, I thought I'd show a highlight review video of the 20,000 kilometer service of a K1300. Now, if you watch this video, you'll notice that a lot of the items in the 20,000 kilometer service are not covered. Fairly straightforward stuff that you may have already seen others do, or you may have done yourself. You'll notice as you watch this video that most of the time is spent covering off the valve clearance check, working with the special tools, as well as changing the air filter and the rear end final drive fluid. These are items that aren't normally done at the 12,000 kilometer service. Now, getting underway, of course, the work starts with removing the bodywork. I follow the manual, so essentially it's the side panels removed, followed by the belly pan. Now, as we remove screws, we are using the Boxflyer boards, which have been a huge success for us, keeping all of our fasteners in the right spot. Now, you'll notice on the front of the side panel, there's 4 screws. One of the screws, the very top one, is actually hidden from view. You have to peel back a rubber panel to actually see it. And of course, the top 3 bolts are in the glove compartment. As you unscrew these last 3 bolts, it's just a matter of unhooking the panel from a rubber grommet in underneath this part right here. So just pry that tongue out and pull the whole thing off gently, and it pops right off. Now, there's one word of caution for here. There are 3 small washers that sit nested inside the rubber receivers on the fairing, and when you pull the fairing off, they can easily fall out. So what you should do is take the time, make sure they're on there, maybe tape them in or put them aside for later use. Now, working on the right-hand side of the bike, the process is the same. Start with the same 3 screws on the bottom and then work your way upwards. Now, if you've watched my R1200 series of service videos, you'll notice that the plastic on this bike seems to be quicker to come off, and that is definitely the case. It's dramatically quicker, even though more of the bike is covered in plastic. So you should be able to take most of the plastic off this bike in 20 to 30 minutes. Now, the belly pan comes off with 2 screws, one on either side, and then in the center part of the belly pan there are 2 metal hooks that you simply slide forward to disengage. Now, under the belly pan, or once the belly pan comes off rather, there are 2 large styrofoam spacers that are simply held on by the plastic screwed on above them, one on either side. Changing the air filter is fairly straightforward. Start by removing the ECU. And then there are 2 clips, the only 2 clips really, that hold the air snorkel up against the air box, and the air filter fits in between these 2 pieces. Those 2 clips slide out, and then the snorkel itself slides out. Behind that is the filter itself. As you can see, it's dirty, and the snorkel inside is dirty. So I clean the snorkel, and I put a new air filter back into the holder. Making sure it's upside right, I slide the snorkel back into its slot, and on the air filter end, there's 2 rails to guide it, so this is fairly straightforward. Around the front nose and slide in. And then obviously I followed up with replacing the 2 clips, and we've just replaced the air filter. The next part is to remove the radiator shroud, and we start by removing the temperature sensor plug. And the shroud is held on with 4 coarse threaded screws. They come out rather quickly, 2 on either side. Once the screws come out, there is a stay at the top. It's basically nothing more than a tongue. Just wiggle the plastic off and the whole unit slides off together. Now I'm following the manual, and the next step is to remove the cover on the left-hand side of the bike where the power LED outlet is. The idea here is to remove this plastic so we can get at the coolant expansion tank, because that will need to be drained. And by the way, if you're used to working on Japanese motorcycles, this expansion tank is pressurized. And the radiator cap has two detents, so it can be difficult to get off for the first time. Time to drain the coolant, and the petcock is a plastic on the lower left-hand side. You can open it with your fingers. Now, once the radiator stops draining its coolant, I close the petcock and I tighten the cover back on the radiator. And then I move around to the coolant expansion tank. I undo the one screw holding it on and then pull it off this tongue where it sits on with a rubber grommet. I open the cap and pour it into my catch basin. The manual doesn't tell you to do this, but for extra room, I actually removed the feeder tube going back to the radiator. It just allowed me to tip the whole unit over into my bucket. You may have to do the same thing. If you're lucky, you won't have to. Keeping everything in order, once it's drained, I rehook up the tube so I don't forget it in the future. And the cap goes back on. Starting on the right-hand side of the bike, I remove the main feeder tube into the radiator on the engine side. I also undo the radiator overflow tube. Next is to disconnect the coolant temperature sensor. It's held in with a twist clip, and it's nothing more than a standard BMW plug. Just unhook it. The radiator is held on with 3 C-clips, and behind each C-clip is a washer. Now these C-clips are unlike the conventional ones that you see in engines. These ones you can pull off with your finger. They're very loosely held on there, and there's lots of play. So you should have no problem just pulling them off. Now obviously start at the bottom and do the top 2 last. On the left-hand side of the bike, the coolant inlet, it needs to be removed. There are 3 large screws that hold it on. They come out and it pops right off. Once you have that loosened up, next thing you do is to remove the hose clamp on the engine side again. It should slide right off, but if it doesn't, just work it a bit with your hand. All these hoses are disconnected. You remove the bottom stay of the radiator, it pulls off, it's held on with a rubber grommet. And then the top 2, and the whole thing comes off in your hand as one unit, hoses and all. Once the radiator's off, we remove the secondary air system. It's held on with 2 screws going into the top of the engine, and the pipes themselves are pressed into the engine with rubber grommets. So you need to use a little bit of force to get them off. And here comes our very first special tool of the process. This is a stick coil remover by BMW. However, many companies offer versions of this tool. Some are more expensive than others, but they all work fairly well. This particular one has a flex head, and you can also adjust the angle of approach on the coil by spinning an adjuster on the back. Regardless of the tool you use, these coils are pressed in there, so you really have to pull, and they almost have a suction cup type pop when they come off. Just pull straight out. One recommended tool in the manual that does not work is the spark plug puller. It's a very well made piece of gear. It's a magnetic head, and it's thin walled to get down in there. However, it can't fit around the corner. So you'll need to use your own spark plug puller. I bought this cheapie at one of my local discount auto supply stores with 2 small extensions. The measurement on this socket is critical. Special tool is 0.809 of an inch, and my socket that I have is 0.864, and it fit. Here's what happens when you try to use the special tool. You can use it on the outside cylinders, but on the inside cylinders it can't get around the dual lever linkage. Now, I've used this on other BMW bikes with no problem. However, with my cheap option, works just fine. 2 extensions and my thin-walled socket. And if the extensions come apart inside the spark plug well, simply use a magnet to get the pieces out. Once you remove the plugs, it's time to remove the valve cover. 3 of the screws are in really tight areas, so I have this low profile Torx set, but you can make your own using a T40 bit, cutting it off and pushing it into a small socket to get what I got. Both will work. The measurement you're looking for here is no greater than 1 5/8 inches total depth, including the head of the ratchet. You'll notice the ignition leads hanging down, and some people worry about those going in the wrong spot, but the leads are so short that really you don't have to worry about that too much. You might want to tape them up to get them out of the way, but generally they're not a problem. Once the valve cover comes off, you have access to everything. We remove the long inner seal. Next up is to remove the crank cover on the right-hand side of the bike. And you use a ratchet and socket to turn the engine. The engine turns in the same direction as the wheels when you're driving forward. Exhaust and intake cam have engaging counter-rotating drive gears. Each gear has a line marked on it and a horseshoe shape marked on it, which corresponds with the opposite cam gear's line and horseshoe. So a line engages with the horseshoe to indicate top dead center. In this case, we want the horseshoe on the exhaust aligned with the line on the intake cam. As with most 4-cylinder motorcycles, cylinders 1 and 4 travel up and down together, and cylinders 2 and 3 travel up and down together. So as you measure the valve clearances, you will measure cylinders 1 and 4, you will rotate the engine appropriately, and then measure cylinders 2 and 3 together. Checking the clearances sometimes requires you to stack 2 feeler gauges on top of one another. That's perfectly normal. I like to record the actual clearances as opposed to just ensuring they are within spec. That way I can track to see if anything falls out of line down the road. Fortunately, none of the valves needed adjusting. However, if you had to, first thing you'd need to do is remove the drive shaft off the water pump and then remove the whole water pump off of the side of the bike. Next, you would need to remove the crank position sensor off the bottom of the engine and replace it with this special tool that locks the crank in place. This is available from BMW. Following that is to remove the cam caps. In order to remove the cam caps, they all have to be removed together, and you need a special tool for that as well. The special tool is actually a set of studs made by BMW. They screw into the spark plug holes of cylinders 2 and 3. And on them, they have a thrust bearing, ball bearing actually, with 2 brass nuts at the top that are so well made you can turn them by hand. They allow the cam cap to come off slowly and in unison as the spring pressure from the valves pushes backwards. So you could make this tool yourself. You need 3/4 of an inch engagement into the sockets for the spark plugs. Then the overall length, as you can see, I have here a touch over 5.5 inches. These have extremely high quality thrust bearings, but you could do something with perhaps some greased washers and some large thumb screws. It wasn't long after this bike was introduced that the owners were experiencing problems with cam chains jumping teeth on the sprockets, which could cause catastrophic damage to the engine. BMW's fix was to retrofit a redesigned engine cover or a cam chain keeper device inside underneath this cover. Part of the service is to ensure that this device is there, and you can see it. It's just a black half-moon shaped piece of plastic. The other check, I'm told, is to make sure that the cam chain tension device has this large oil pot on top of it. If your bike does not have the chain retention device on the opening for the crank, you'll need to remove the cover and replace it either with a new cover, or if you can source one, just the piece of plastic with the new bolts. Put everything back together. And speaking of putting things back together, it's time to put the crank cover back on. Put the spark plug seal gasket back on top of the valve covers. and put the valve cover itself back on. Screw everything down and torque it. After you torque these screws, you'll need to snap in each of the stick coils. They pop in with an audible click. And each lead plugs in also with a much softer click all the way in. The secondary air system gets re-engaged into each one of the holes. I like to put a little bit of non-oil-based lube to allow them to go in a little better. And then the screws go down to hold it all together. And here's a tip. Run your radiator overflow tube on top of the valve cover gasket before you put the top shroud on. It'll make life a whole lot easier. As you prepare to put the radiator back on, I like to hook on the temperature sensor lead first. Then I put the radiator on using the top two studs first. You're going to wrap all the piping and tubing around the engine and then gently slide the radiator onto the two top studs. Once the radiator is hanging there properly, you can slide the hoses back onto the engine, and then the lower stay slides onto the bottom stud of the radiator. And then over to the left side of the engine, we slide the hose on to the boss, and then the water pump housing gets screwed back on and torqued down to spec. Now once all the hoses get reconnected and tightened down, I move over and I put the C-clips back on the main studs to hold the radiator together. They slide right back on. You don't need lube or a whole lot of pressure. Here I'm installing a zip tie that I cut off earlier in the disassembly. Next, as we prepare to refill the cooling system, I remove the ECU because I will need a lot of space above the radiator cover. Here, as per the manual, I need to clamp off the overflow coming out of the radiator to the overflow tank. And then I use a vacuum lift Clearview fill system. This tool is recommended by BMW to fill the system. It creates a vacuum, closes off that vacuum tight, and then replenishes the system, rushing in with coolant. Once the coolant rushes in to fill the vacuum, I in turn have to bleed off on the left-hand side of the bike above the water pump a small plastic valve that allows that last little air bubble to escape until coolant comes out. And on the water pump itself, there's actually a bleed nipple there that needs to be bled. So we open that up, and once the bubbles stop coming out, it's solid coolant, we close it back off again. And although not shown here on film, I actually check the level of coolant inside the overflow tank. Now once everything gets tightened down, we move to reassembly, starting with the ECU unit that gets screwed back on. Another process I'm going to show you here on this video is to change the final drive oil in the rear end. This involves removing the muffler to get at the rear wheel. The muffler is fairly straightforward. There's a ball joint connection in the front and a stay bolt at the back. You have to be careful. The muffler will fall if you don't support it as you remove these two fasteners. And once the wheel comes off, the next process is to remove the rear caliper. And you're not totally removing it from the bike, you're just moving it up and out of the way without disconnecting it. This allows you to get at the oil drain without spilling oil into the critical braking system. I like to use these removable and reusable key ties to hold things up. They hook in and unhook easily using keyhole slots. You should always remove the fill hole bolt first. That way, if you can't get it open, there's no need to drain the oil until you get that fixed. The drain is down underneath. Once drained, you will need to replace the sealing ring on the bolt itself, and of course torque the bolt to proper specifications. I have two-stroke race bikes, so I use these syringes to mix oil. I bought a few extra ones for this sort of purpose, and they work dandy. And of course torque the filler bolt. Although I don't show the whole brake fluid flushing process, there's a couple things I would like to point out in this video. First thing I'd like to show you is that the front brake reservoir has a foam baffle in it called a grill insert by BMW. This has to be replaced with each fluid flush. Now the purpose of this grill should be obvious to some of us who've done some road racing. When you ride a sport bike aggressively, brake fluid can actually boil up and spill out of the reservoir. Now on a $25,000 motorcycle, that's not so great. So this insert prevents and reduces the splash of the brake fluid inside the reservoir. As I mentioned, I'm not going to show the entire brake flushing service. I did replace the bleeders on the calipers with speed bleeders. But in addition to bleeding the calipers, you need to bleed the master cylinder up top here, and there's a small bleed screw at the back, as you can see. So, due to time constraints, unfortunately, most of the reassembly I didn't get a chance to record. However, it's fairly straightforward. The body panels go back on the bike in the reverse order they came off, as does the muffler. Anyway, until next time.